The night was cruelly silent, until Jake heard his own scream tearing through the stillness. A scream he knew had been his last. Jake stumbled forward, clutching his chest, his breath uneven, his voice cracking as he whispered, "I already died here." The walls of Jake's small apartment shook with echoes, each vibration carrying fragments of a voice identical to his own. Jake's hands trembled as he pressed them against the peeling wallpaper, feeling warmth pulse beneath it like a living vein. The air smelled of rust and damp wood, suffocating in its weight. A whisper slithered through the dark. "Jake, come back." Jake's mind spun, and his eyes darted across the shadows where no one stood, yet every corner seemed filled with a presence. Jake muttered, "No, it's not real, it's not real," but dread wrapped around him like chains. The floor creaked with heavy steps Jake did not take, and he realized the past was no longer behind him. It was here, trapping him. Jake woke drenched in sweat, clutching the edge of his bed as though it was the only anchor keeping him from sinking. Jake whispered, "Just a dream, it was just a dream," but the echo of his scream still vibrated in his ears. The dim glow of the alarm clock painted the room in sickly green digits. Jake's eyes darted to the corners where shadows pooled, darker than they should be. The silence pressed against him heavier than death. The air felt suffocating as if the walls closed tighter around him. Jake dragged his hand across his face, muttering, "I can't keep living like this," his voice breaking. Then the whisper came again, softer this time, his own voice repeating, "Jake, you already know the truth." Jake froze with his breath caught in his throat, as fear bloomed like poison. Jake stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, desperate to wash away the echoes clinging to him. The cracked mirror stared back with his pale reflection, but Jake's lips moved though he had not spoken. Jake froze as the reflection whispered, "You died already." His stomach turned as he pressed both palms against the sink veins throbbing. Jake shook his head, muttering, "No, I'm alive, I'm here." The reflection grinned faintly, an expression Jake had not made. The buzzing light overhead grew louder, filling the room with static hum. Jake stumbled backward, breathing heavy as the mirror surface rippled like water, twisting his reflection into something unrecognizable. The apartment groaned as if it remembered every death within its walls. Jake's footsteps echoed louder than they should as he entered the living room. "Wah, wah." His eyes fixed on the grandfather clock, its hands frozen at midnight. Jake muttered, broken, yet the ticking sound filled the air, drilling into his mind. Jake pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound only grew inside his skull. The wallpaper pulsed faintly with red light. Jake whispered, "Please stop," his voice cracking. Then the clock chimed once, though its hands had not moved. The sound lingered like a death toll. Jake collapsed into the torn chair, trembling as though the world itself had turned against him. Jake sat, trembling, staring at the wall, as whispers circled him like vultures. His own voice echoed, overlapping until unbearable. Jake shouted, "Get out of my head!" but the sound twisted inhuman. Jake pressed his palms to his temples, body shaking violently. The air grew colder, his breath visible, the wallpaper veins glowing brighter, pulsing with his heartbeat. Jake whispered, "I don't want to die again," but the whisper replied, calm and cruel, "You never stop dying." Jake collapsed to his knees, eyes wide in horror as the shadows swallowed the last trace of light. Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee. Steam long faded into cold air. He whispered, "I can't keep doing this," his voice cracking with exhaustion. The silence pressed against him until the chair across from him groaned, though it was empty. Jake's heart pounded as he froze, unable to look away. A shadow stretched across the linoleum floor, growing longer though no one stood there. Jake gripped the table, whispering, "Show yourself." A laugh echoed, faint and cruel, his own voice mocking him. The refrigerator buzzed louder until it roared like static, swallowing the air. Jake slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "Stop it!" The lights flickered, plunging him into momentary darkness before revealing nothing but the same empty chair waiting for him to break. Jake wandered into the hallway where the air felt heavier, as though every breath carried weight. The wallpaper here was darker, veins of faint red glowing beneath the surface like blood pumping through the walls. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing the paper, and the glow spread beneath his touch. He muttered, "It's alive," and pulled back quickly, chest tightening. The echo of footsteps followed him, though his own steps were soft and slow. Jake spun around and shouted, "Who's there?" But the hallway remained empty, shadows swallowing its length. A whisper came from behind him, calm and mocking, "You never left." Jake stumbled backward until his shoulders pressed against the pulsing wall. His breath came fast, shallow and cold, as if the house itself was exhaling into him. Jake pushed open the door to the living room again, and froze. A figure sat in his old armchair, its back to him. His pulse hammered in his ears as he whispered, "Who are you?" The figure did not answer, its shape blurry like smoke-given form. Jake took one step closer, and the chair creaked louder. Suddenly, the figure turned its head, revealing Jake's own face, pale and twisted into a grin he had never worn. His knees buckled as he muttered, "No, that's not me." The double stood slowly, its eyes black voids that swallowed light. Jake staggered back, nearly tripping over the warped floorboards. His own voice echoed from the double's mouth, "You were never supposed to leave." Jake froze in horror as the figure advanced. Jake ran into the bathroom, slamming the door shut and pressing his back against it. His chest heaved as he gasped, "This isn't real. It can't be real." The mirror trembled slightly on the wall, glass vibrating as if responding to his fear. Jake stepped closer, his reflection rippling like disturbed water. Suddenly, another face pushed through the reflection, pale and screaming, though Jake himself remained silent. Jake stumbled back, knocking over bottles that shattered across the tiles. The face in the mirror whispered in a broken voice, "You belong here," before vanishing into his reflection. Jake grabbed the sink, his knuckles white, whispering, "I won't let you take me." The light above buzzed until it burst, plunging the bathroom into choking darkness. Jake stumbled into his bedroom, clutching his head, his breath ragged. The air had grown icy, his breath visible in pale clouds. He sat on the edge of the bed, whispering, "I just need to rest." The sheets shifted beside him as though someone unseen had lain down. Jake leapt to his feet, eyes wide, whispering, "No, not here." The mattress sagged under invisible weight, the impression of a body pressing downward. Jake reached out a trembling hand, only for the sheets to tighten as if gripping something that wasn't there. A whisper came from the bed, soft and taunting, "You can't escape me." Jake staggered backward, hitting the dresser as the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief bursts of suffocating darkness. Jake wandered through the apartment as if pulled by invisible strings, every step echoing louder than the last. His body trembled, sweat dripping down his face, though the air had turned freezing. He whispered, "I can't keep running from this." The hallway stretched unnaturally long, walls bending inward as though the house itself wanted to consume him. Jake's breaths came shallow, clouding before his eyes as he stumbled toward the living room. The old clock ticked again, though its hands remained frozen at midnight, and the sound drilled into his mind. He shouted, "Stop it!" But the ticking only grew louder until it was joined by faint laughter. The laughter was his own voice, twisted into something mocking and cruel. Jake pressed his hands to his ears, stumbling backward into the wall, but the voice echoed inside his head. "You know the truth," it whispered, smooth and venomous. Jake collapsed onto his knees, muttering, "No, I won't listen." But the floor pulsed with red veins that throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the dim light at the far end of the hall. It was a woman, her form shadowed, her eyes hollow yet glimmering faintly. She whispered, "Jake," her voice breaking, soft with sorrow. Jake gasped, recognizing her face, the woman he thought he had forgotten. The tragic victim had returned, and the house was making him remember. Jake stared at the woman, his breath faltering. "You're not real," he whispered, but the woman stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the warped floor. She looked broken, fragile, her lips trembling as though words were trapped behind them. Jake backed away, muttering, "I don't know you, but a flood of memory pushed against his skull, sharp and agonizing. The woman whispered, "You left me here," her voice fractured with pain. Jake shook his head violently, whispering, "No, I never." But the words died in his throat. Her eyes locked on his, hollow yet burning with grief. Jake felt chains tightening around his chest, his heart racing as though the memory he had buried was dragging him back into the past. Jake stumbled into the kitchen, gasping, his chest heaving as though chains pulled tight across his ribs. The woman followed slowly, her face flickering between sorrow and rage. Jake grabbed a chair, holding it as a barrier, muttering, "Stay back." She tilted her head, her voice soft yet sharp, "You promised me." The words cut through him like glass. Jake's mind spun, fragments of memory clawing to the surface. Promises whispered long ago, broken in silence. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I didn't mean to." Her expression twisted into anguish, tears streaming down her pale face. Suddenly, the refrigerator door creaked open by itself, and the cold air filled the room, freezing Jake's breath. Her whisper became louder, echoing through the kitchen walls. "You left me to die." Jake dropped the chair as terror rooted him in place. Jake backed into the living room, the floor creaking under his unsteady steps. The woman lingered in the doorway, her presence filling the air with grief and anger. Jake muttered, "I tried to forget," his voice breaking, but she shook her head slowly, whispering, "Forgetting doesn't free you." The clock chimed once again, though its hands never moved. Jake screamed, "Stop it!" but the sound swallowed his voice. Shadows stretched from the corners, twisting around the woman, merging with her form until her body flickered like smoke. Jake fell to the ground, pressing his palms against his face, whispering, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But her voice was everywhere, filling every space, reminding him of what he had buried. "You left me," she whispered again, her voice now echoing from every wall. Jake crawled backward across the floor, his eyes wide, his chest heaving as though every breath was stolen from him. The woman drifted closer, her bare feet not touching the ground anymore. Her eyes burned with grief and anger, her voice trembling, "You knew I was here." Jake shook his head violently, whispering, "I didn't know. I didn't know." But the truth cut into him, memories surfacing that he could no longer deny. He had left her. He had turned away from her cries long ago. The walls pulsed brighter with red veins, each beat in rhythm with her words. "You let me die," she whispered, and Jake's scream tore through the room. Shadows closed in tighter until only her face remained visible, pale, broken, unforgettable. Jake staggered into the hallway, clutching the wall for balance. His breaths were sharp, his chest heaving as if the air itself fought him. He whispered, "She's not real," but his voice cracked with doubt. The house moaned, wooden beams groaning like they were alive. From the far end of the hall, the woman stood again, her figure fading in and out as if stitched from shadow and memory. She whispered, "You remember me now." Jake's eyes widened, panic surging, and he shouted, "No, I never knew you." The walls pulsed, veins glowing brighter, each beat sensing with his heartbeat. Jake pressed his back against the wall, sliding downward, trembling. The woman stepped closer, her eyes hollow yet burning, her lips curling into a faint, grief-stricken smile that was more terrifying than anger. Jake forced himself to his feet and stumbled toward the living room, his hands shaking violently. The woman followed silently, her movements slow but relentless, like she had all the time in the world. Jake shouted, "Why are you doing this to me?" But his own voice answered from the shadows, mocking him, "You already know." Jake froze, chest tightening, realization clawing at him. He gasped, "You're not her. You're me." The woman's face twisted, her expression flickering between sorrow and rage. She whispered, "I am what you left behind." The words hit Jake harder than any physical blow, his knees nearly giving out as the shadows reached for him. Jake grabbed the chair from the corner, holding it in front of him like a shield, his breaths ragged. He shouted, "Stay away from me!" The woman stopped, tilting her head, her expression unreadable. Then the voice from the walls came again. His own voice, low and venomous. You left her. Jake's grip tightened until his knuckles went white. His eyes darted to the broken picture frame on the wall, where his reflection twisted into a grin he had never made. The woman's lips trembled as she whispered, "You can't hide from yourself." Jake staggered backward, his body trembling as though his bones themselves rejected the truth clawing at him. Jake fell to the floor, dropping the chair with a crash. His palms pressed into the warped wood, and his voice cracked as he muttered, "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." The woman knelt in front of him, her eyes glowing faintly, her hands reaching but never touching him. She whispered, "Intentions don't change what you did." Jake shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face, his body trembling. The walls vibrated, the faint ticking of the frozen clock growing louder like a hammer against his skull. Jake covered his ears and screamed, "Stop it!" But the sound grew until the whole room shook. Shadows wrapped around the woman, and for a moment she looked more like Jake than herself, her face flickering into his. Jake crawled backward, his body weak, eyes wide as terror consumed him. The woman rose slowly, her form twisting with shadows that spread across the room. She whispered, "This is where you belong," her voice both hers and his. Jake shook his head, whispering, "No, I can fight this." But the truth burned in his chest, and the house itself groaned like it agreed with her. The ceiling cracked, dust falling, as the walls pulsed with red light in rhythm with his heart. The woman's face softened with sorrow as she whispered, "It's too late." Jake screamed, his body shaking violently, as the shadows surged forward, swallowing the last sliver of light that clung to the room. Jake sat on the floor of the living room, his chest rising and falling in painful gasps. His eyes darted toward the woman standing in front of him, her body flickering between shadow and flesh. Jake whispered, "You're not her. You're me," his voice trembling. The woman's lips quivered, her voice carrying both grief and accusation. "I am what you abandoned." Jake shook his head violently, clutching his hair as if trying to tear the memory from his skull. The clock ticked loudly, though its hands still froze at midnight, each sound striking like a hammer against his chest. The woman stepped closer, sorrow carved into her pale face, whispering, "You left me to suffer." Jake screamed, "No," as tears streamed down his face. Jake forced himself to stand, staggering backward toward the hallway. His body trembled, every muscle weak, but his eyes burned with desperation. He shouted, "Tell me what you want." The woman's face contorted, her sorrow collapsing into rage. Her voice deepened, layered with echoes of Jake's own voice. "I want you to see." Jake froze as visions rushed into his head, flashes of the night he had buried in silence. He saw himself walking away from her cries, saw the blood, saw the darkness consume her. His stomach churned, and he whispered, "No, that wasn't me." But the memory dug deeper, undeniable. The woman's voice echoed, "You already know the truth." Jake stumbled into the kitchen, clutching the counter as visions blurred his sight. Blood smeared across his memory, shadows whispering in voices he could not silence. Jake whispered, "It wasn't my fault," but the words felt hollow. The woman appeared in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on him, her body trembling as though torn between grief and vengeance. She whispered, "You left me alone to die." Jake shouted, "I didn't know." His voice cracked into desperation. The refrigerator door opened again with a loud creak, cold mist spilling across the floor, freezing Jake's breath. The woman stepped closer, her pale hand lifting as if to reach for him, her whisper sharp and final. "But you chose to forget." Jake fell to his knees on the kitchen floor, his palms pressing into the cold tile. His tears mixed with the blood he imagined dripping from his hands, though his skin remained clean. He whispered, "I couldn't save you," but the woman's voice pierced his confession, "You never tried." Jake's chest convulsed as sobs tore through him, his eyes squeezing shut as the walls pulsed with red veins. The house groaned like it shared in his guilt. Jake lifted his face, whispering, "I didn't want this. But the woman stood above him, her face half in shadow, whispering, "But you chose this silence." Jake crawled backward from the woman, his body trembling as if every muscle was about to snap. He shouted, "You're not real," but the words echoed weakly. The woman drifted closer, her form breaking apart like smoke yet reforming again. Her eyes glowed faintly red as her voice rang through the house. "You carry me in you. I am your death." Jake screamed, clutching his chest as pain shot through his body, his vision blurring. The clock chimed loudly, a single note that reverberated through his bones. Jake fell onto his back, gasping as the woman loomed over him. Her pale hand reached down, trembling with sorrow and fury, whispering, "This is the truth you buried." Jake staggered into the center of the living room, clutching his chest as if his heart would burst. The walls pulsed violently, red veins spreading like fire across the wallpaper. He shouted, "This isn't real." But the voice answered from every direction, his own voice layered with a deeper growl. "It has always been real." Jake spun, his eyes wide, searching for the source, but the shadows thickened, swallowing every corner. The woman stood in front of him again, her form fractured between her pale face and his reflection. She whispered, "You were always part of me." Jake's knees buckled as he gasped, "No, I'm not you." But the shadows pressed in, cold and suffocating, making it impossible to breathe. The ceiling cracked with a groan, dust raining down as Jake stumbled backward. He shouted, "I won't give in," but the voice boomed louder, shaking the room. "You already did." The woman advanced, her body unraveling into black smoke that wrapped around Jake like chains. Jake gasped, clawing at the darkness as it constricted his chest. He whispered desperately, "I can fight this," but the smoke coiled tighter, searing his skin with icy pain. The woman's broken face flickered through the smoke, whispering, "You carry me." Jake screamed, falling to his knees as his own shadow twisted upward from the floor, mirroring his body but grinning with malice. Jake's shadow loomed taller, its face a warped version of his own, grinning with teeth too sharp. It spoke in his voice but deeper. "You were always mine." Jake shouted, "You're not me!" His fists pounded the floor, the sound echoing through the trembling house. The woman's voice whispered from the walls, layered with grief and rage, "You let me die." Jake's eyes filled with tears as he screamed, "I didn't mean to." The shadow bent over him, its grin widening, hands stretching long and claw-like. Jake's body shook violently, his breath tearing from his lungs as he whispered, "I won't let you take me." The walls cracked, the house shaking as if rejecting his denial. Jake collapsed onto his back, chest heaving as the shadow loomed over him. Its hands pressed against his chest, sinking into him as though merging. Jake screamed, "Get out of me!" The woman's figure appeared beside the shadow, her sorrowful face inches from his. She whispered, "You can't kill what you are." Jake shook his head violently, clawing at the shadow's arms, but his hands passed through like smoke. The veins in the walls pulsed brighter, the room glowing red like a living wound. Jake's eyes rolled as the weight of the shadow pressed deeper into him, suffocating him with his own reflection. His scream echoed like a death cry. Jake's body convulsed as the shadow sank fully into him, his face twisting between agony and madness. He gasped, "I'm not you," but his voice split, one desperate and one cruel. The woman whispered, "You are both," her voice breaking with grief. Jake's eyes turned black for a moment, his mouth curling into a twisted grin that was not his own. He staggered to his feet, clutching his chest, whispering, "I can feel it inside me." The house groaned, the walls cracking, dust falling in clouds. The clock chimed again, each note shaking him deeper into despair. Jake screamed, his voice layered with the shadow's growl, "I won't be your prisoner." But the red veins pulsed faster, proving the house had already claimed him. Jake staggered through the shaking apartment, every step dragging as though the floor clung to him. His chest ached, and his breaths came ragged, each one clouding the freezing air. The walls pulsed violently, glowing veins spreading outward like arteries bursting open. He shouted, "I won't let this consume me." But his voice split, half his own and half the guttural growl of the shadow. The woman appeared again in front of him, her pale figure fractured with sorrow, her eyes burning like dying embers. She whispered, "You can't escape what you are." Jake trembled, his knees buckling as he cried, "I didn't kill you." The woman's face flickered, grief deepening as she whispered, "You abandoned me, and that was enough." The words hit Jake like a blade and he screamed, slamming his fists into the floor until blood streaked his hands. The clock chimed again, louder than before, its hands still frozen at midnight. The house groaned and cracked, dust falling from the ceiling like ash from a dying fire. Jake gasped. "This is my prison," his voice breaking. The woman reached forward, her trembling hand passing through his chest, her touch like ice piercing his heart. She whispered, "This is your death, and you will relive it forever." Jake screamed, his voice echoing through the collapsing house as the shadows swarmed him, pulling him into their endless void. Jake awoke in silence, his body lying on the living room floor. The apartment was still, the walls no longer pulsing but dark and lifeless. His chest rose weakly, his breath faint and shallow. He whispered, "It's over," though the words felt fragile, empty. Slowly, Jake pushed himself up, his arms trembling, and looked around. The woman was gone, but her presence still lingered in the thick, heavy air. Jake's eyes darted to the clock, its hands frozen at midnight, yet the faint ticking persisted. He muttered, "No, it can't still be happening." The sound grew louder, drilling into his ears until his body shivered with dread. Jake stumbled toward the clock, each step unsteady, as though dragged by invisible chains. He whispered, "Please, stop," his voice breaking into tears. But when he reached the clock, the glass shattered, and behind the face of the clock, he saw his own reflection. The reflection grinned at him, its eyes black voids, whispering, "It never ends." Jake staggered back, his scream echoing through the empty house, as the reflection stepped out of the clock, merging with the shadows around him. Jake ran through the apartment, doors slamming shut behind him as though the house itself trapped him. He screamed, "Let me out!" pounding his fists against the front door. The wood vibrated but refused to open. His body trembled as shadows crawled across the floor, climbing the walls like living veins. Jake turned, his back pressed against the door, eyes wide. The reflection of himself stepped from the shadows, grinning, its eyes hollow black pits. It whispered in his voice, "You were never meant to escape." Jake shouted, "I'm not you," but his voice cracked, fear crushing the defiance. The double tilted its head, smiling wider, whispering, "You already gave in." Jake lunged forward, his fists swinging wildly, but his blows passed through the double as though striking smoke. The reflection's grin widened as it stepped into him, merging until his screams were drowned in silence. The house went still, every sound fading, until only the frozen midnight clock ticked once more. Jake fell to the floor, his eyes now hollow, his body trembling as the shadow inside him whispered endlessly. Jake sat slumped in the corner, his head bowed, his breath shallow. His eyes, once terrified, now looked empty, hollowed out by despair. The woman appeared faintly, her pale figure blurred like mist. She whispered, "You could never change it." Jake lifted his face, muttering, "I tried," but the words fell lifeless. The woman's sorrowful gaze lingered on him before she faded into the walls. Jake pressed his palms against his face, rocking back and forth, whispering, "It never ends, it never ends." The silence around him was suffocating, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock, eternal and unrelenting. Jake's body collapsed onto the floor, his last strength gone. His eyes stared upward, unblinking, as the ceiling cracked open above him. Darkness poured down, swallowing the room like a tide. The clock chimed one final time, though its hands never moved. Jake whispered weakly, "Please, let me go," his voice breaking. From the shadows his own voice answered, cruel and final, "You belong here." His mouth opened in a silent scream as the darkness consumed him. The apartment fell silent once more, the frozen midnight clock standing as the only witness. Somewhere deep in the silence, Jake's whisper echoed again, faint but endless. I already died here.